The most powerful piece in chess is a woman. Think about that. A game invented in ancient India, spread by Persian kings, and obsessed over by European men, and yet the queen rules the board. The king, he shuffles one sad little square at a time. But the queen, she slices across rows, files, and diagonals like a storm. How the hell did a man's game crown a woman as its deadliest weapon? To answer that, you have to trace the story of queens in history, from powerless figures to rulers who reshaped empires, and finally to the 64 squares where they became unstoppable. In the earliest versions of chess, the so-called queen wasn't a queen at all. In chaturanga from India and shatranj from Persia, this piece was the vizier, the king's advisor, a male vizier with shockingly limited power. He could only move a single square diagonally, making him almost useless compared to rooks or knights. Imagine that the future powerhouse of the board began as a fragile pawn-level bureaucrat. It's almost ironic that the weakest piece would one day become the deadliest. This weakness mattered. Games played in the Islamic Golden Age were slower, more positional, with battles grinding around soldiers and elephants, not queens. Nobody feared the vizier, and nobody thought of him as a game changer. He was a token of authority, a nod to hierarchy, not an engine of destruction. Therefore, in its original world, chess reflected rigid politics. The king commanded, the vizier advised, everyone else obeyed. But things would shift the moment the game crossed into Europe. In medieval Europe, queens were no longer just ceremonial figures. Some ruled with an iron grip. Eleanor of Aquitaine, born in 1122, controlled vast lands in France, and later became queen of both France and England. Isabella of Castile, crowned in 1474, launched Spain's global empire alongside Ferdinand. These women weren't passive consorts. They brokered alliances, commanded armies, and reshaped kingdoms. Suddenly, the idea of a queen as the most powerful piece on the board didn't feel like fantasy anymore. This was the century when chess began to mirror reality. The old vizier was gone, replaced by a queen who could cut across the board with ruthless precision. It wasn't just a game tweak. It was cultural symbolism. Europe was living through an era where female rulers actually changed the course of history, and players wanted their game to reflect that. Therefore, what began as a minor adjustment in design became a radical statement: women could dominate both throne and battlefield. The feminization of chess reshaped how people played. Strategy shifted suddenly. The game revolved around the queen's explosive power, much like politics revolved around the charisma of real queens. The board became a theater of ambition, intrigue, and danger, where one decisive move by the queen could topple a king. It felt like history itself was teaching players that underestimating women was a fatal mistake. And this transformation would only accelerate as Europe stumbled into the Renaissance. Do you want me to push forward into that Renaissance leap when the queen's power became almost supernatural compared to every other piece? In the 15th century, chess went through a revolution so dramatic that players called it Mad Queen's chess. Suddenly, the queen, once a useless piece, crawling one square at a time, exploded with power. She could streak across the board in every direction, moving with the speed and dominance we recognize today. No other reform in chess history ever shifted the game so violently. It felt like watching a timid pawn suddenly transform into a god of war. This wasn't random. It happened in Spain and Italy, lands where the Renaissance was reshaping art, politics, and gender roles. Isabella of Castile wasn't just a queen. She was a ruler who unified Spain, launched Columbus, and dictated the future of Europe. Giving the queen unrivaled mobility on the board mirrored her terrifying authority in real life. The game became a cultural echo. When queens dominated thrones, queens dominated chessboards too. The consequences were massive. Chess sped up, turning from slow medieval slog into the sharp, tactical, explosive battle we know today. Players had to rethink everything because one queen could now swing the balance in a heartbeat. Games became shorter, bloodier, more dramatic, like Renaissance politics themselves. And just like that, a board game quietly absorbed the spirit of an age when queens weren't ornaments, but revolutionaries. On the chessboard, the paradox is obvious. The king is the piece you must protect, but the queen is the one who actually rules. While the king crawls a single square at a time, the queen storms across the battlefield with terrifying freedom. This inversion of power made the game itself a cultural statement, whether players realized it or not. It whispered a truth society often denied. Sometimes the throne's real authority isn't the king, but the queen beside him. Historians today often treat the queen's rise in chess as a symbolic echo of early feminism. In a world where women were mostly confined to shadows, the game suddenly placed a woman at the center of power. That shift carried weight. It wasn't just entertainment, it was metaphor. The chessboard suggested what courts and chronicles rarely admitted: women could lead, dominate, and dictate the fate of nations. This is why the queen's power is more than a rule change. It's a cultural landmark. Every match you play reminds you that the most dangerous piece wears a crown and happens to be female. For many scholars, that made chess one of the first mainstream spaces where female authority wasn't erased, but celebrated. In the silence of 64 squares, the queen became a feminist icon centuries before the word even existed. If this story made you see chess in a new light, hit that subscribe button and stick around. We dive deep into the hidden histories behind the game's wars and ideas that shaped our world. And tell me in the comments, do you think the queen's dominance on the board was just coincidence, or the earliest nod to feminism in disguise?